At Boston's most prestigious hospital, a doctor was ridiculed for her race. When they discovered who the sedated patient really was, the silence was deafening. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Sarah Johnson walked through the empty hospital corridor at 4:45 a.m. Her footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor, matching the steady beeping of distant monitors. She adjusted her stethoscope, the cool metal pressing against her neck as she made her way to the resident's workroom. Another day, she muttered, scanning her ID badge to enter the room. The door clicked open, revealing a space filled with the soft glow of computer screens and the smell of day-old coffee. Sarah dropped her bag beside a worn office chair and logged into the system. Patient charts filled her screen. The morning rounds waited for no one, especially not in Boston General's emergency department. Her dark fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, reviewing overnight admissions and lab results. A voice from yesterday's staff meeting echoed in her mind. Dr. Johnson, are you sure you understood the treatment protocol correctly? She'd understood it perfectly. Just like she'd understood it during her years at Harvard Medical School, where she graduated top of her class. Just like she'd understood it through her residency, where she consistently received outstanding evaluations. But somehow, that question kept coming up. The overhead speaker crackled. Major trauma incoming. All available emergency staff to Bay 1. ETA, 3 minutes. Sarah grabbed her white coat and ran. The emergency department doors slid open as ambulance lights painted the bay in rotating red. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a gurney. What do we have? Sarah called out, falling into step beside them. Male, mid-30s, construction site accident. Possible internal bleeding, multiple fractures. BP dropping, currently at 90/60ths. Dr. Catherine Wells appeared beside them, her red blazer stark against the white hospital walls. I'll take this one, she announced, barely glancing at Sarah. Dr. Wells, I can monitor the patient in Bay 3 instead. Catherine's tone left no room for discussion. He's stable but needs observation. Sarah swallowed her frustration and nodded. Yes, doctor. In Bay 3, an elderly man slept peacefully, his vitals strong and steady. Sarah checked his chart, made notes, and tried not to think about the trauma case she could have handled. Through the glass partition, she watched Dr. Wells work, issuing rapid orders with the confidence of someone who never had their competence questioned. The morning progressed with a steady stream of patients. Sarah treated 3 cases of severe flu, a broken arm, and a panic attack. Each diagnosis was precise, each treatment plan carefully considered. She knew she was good at her job. She didn't just know it. She proved it every single day. During a brief moment of quiet, Sarah stood in the break room, staring at her reflection in the microwave door. Dark circles lined her eyes, evidence of countless double shifts and on-call nights. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly, every detail of her appearance carefully maintained. In this hospital, she couldn't afford to look anything less than perfect. You handled that panic attack case well, Nurse Rodriguez said, entering the room. The patient's family was impressed. Thanks, Maria. Sarah managed a small smile. Dr. Wells passed by earlier. Didn't say anything, but she saw how you handled it. Did she? Sarah's voice remained neutral, but her hand tightened around her coffee cup. I'm sure she did. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Everyone knew how Dr. Catherine Wells operated. Her reputation for being demanding was well known, just like her habit of being particularly demanding with certain residents. Sarah's pager buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. New patient in Bay 4, semi-conscious male, immediate attention required. She drained her coffee cup and straightened her coat. Duty calls, she said to Maria, heading for the door. Sarah? Maria called after her. You're twice the doctor she is. Don't let her make you forget that. Sarah nodded, but didn't respond. She couldn't afford to engage in that conversation. Not here, not now. Besides, her record spoke for itself. Perfect diagnosis rate, excellent patient outcomes, stellar recommendations from other attending physicians. Everything except Dr. Wells' approval. The emergency department's automatic doors whooshed open as Sarah approached Bay 4. A nurse was already there, checking vitals on a middle-aged man who lay still on the bed. Something about his symptoms caught her attention immediately, something that didn't quite match the initial assessment. Her pager buzzed again. DR. Wells was on her way down. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would handle it with the same professionalism she always did. She had earned her place here, regardless of what anyone thought. "Patient's vitals?" she asked the nurse, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. The monitor beeped steadily as she began her examination, unaware that the next few hours would change everything. BP 130/85, heart rate 82, temperature 99.1. The nurse reported as Sarah examined the patient. Found unconscious at his office. Co-workers say he complained of a headache earlier. Sarah leaned closer, noting the patient's shallow breathing. Something wasn't adding up. His pupils showed a subtle difference in size, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She pulled out her pen light for a closer check. "Run a complete blood panel," Sarah ordered, and prep for a CT scan. The door swung open. DR. Wells strode in, her red blazer like a warning sign against the sterile white walls. "Update me," she demanded, not looking at Sarah, but rather at the patient's chart in her hands. "Male, mid-50s, found unconscious at work," Sarah reported. "Initial assessment suggests probable stress-induced syncope, DR." Wells cut in, glancing at the vitals monitor. "Common enough in executives. Start him on fluids and monitor." Sarah cleared her throat. "DR. Wells, I noticed some concerning symptoms that might indicate DR. Johnson." Wells' voice carried that familiar edge. "This is a simple case. Don't overcomplicate it." The patient's finger twitched. Sarah noticed, but kept her focus on DR. Wells. His pupils are unequally dilated, combined with the sudden onset headache and loss of consciousness. "Are you questioning my assessment?" Wells turned fully toward her now. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face. "How many similar cases have you handled in your residency?" "Enough to recognize the signs of a potential subarachnoid hemorrhage." A nurse entering the bay dropped a clipboard. The clatter seemed to emphasize the sudden tension in the room. "A subarachnoid hemorrhage?" Wells' laugh was sharp and short. "Because clearly a simple fainting spell couldn't possibly be just that. You need to diagnose something more dramatic, don't you?" Sarah stood her ground. "The symptoms support my concern. We should order a CT scan to rule it out. Do you know how much unnecessary testing costs this hospital every year?" Wells stepped closer. "This is exactly why we need to maintain strict protocols rather than indulging every resident's need to prove themselves." The patient's monitors showed a slight irregularity in heart rhythm. Sarah glanced at them, then back at DR. "Wells, with respect, doctor, I believe." "You believe?" Wells' voice dripped with condescension. "Tell me, DR. Johnson, what exactly were your board scores again? I'm curious about the standards these days." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her chest tighten, but kept her voice steady. "My board scores were in the 99th percentile. Fascinating how that happens now." Wells made a note on the chart. "Start the patient on fluids. Monitor for 2 hours. If vitals remain stable, prepare for discharge." DR. Wells, was I unclear, DR? Johnson. The patient's hand moved slightly. Sarah saw it from the corner of her eye, a subtle tremor that strengthened her conviction. "No, you weren't unclear," Sarah said. "But I have to insist on the CT scan." Wells set down the chart with deliberate slowness. "You have to insist?" "Yes." Sarah pulled up the patient's vitals on the monitor. "Look at these readings. The pattern suggests. It suggests that you're overstepping." Wells' voice rose slightly. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes me question the wisdom of certain admissions policies." A nurse busied herself with checking 4 lines, pointedly not looking at either doctor. Sarah felt heat rise in her neck, but continued. The medical indicators are clear to those with proper experience." Wells picked up the chart again. "Sometimes I wonder if our desire for diversity has overshadowed our commitment to excellence." The words hit like physical blows, but Sarah focused on the patient. His breathing had changed, subtle but significant. The monitors showed another slight irregularity. "Order the CT," Sarah said quietly. Wells turned slowly. Excuse me? As the resident physician currently assigned to this patient, I am ordering a CT scan. Sarah met Wells' gaze. I will take full responsibility for the decision and document my reasoning thoroughly. You're exceeding your authority. No, I'm doing my job. Sarah moved to the computer and began entering the order. If you want to report me to the chief resident, that's your right. But this patient needs a CT scan, and he needs it now. Wells stood perfectly still. The overhead lights hummed. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of a crash cart being rolled. You're making a mistake, Wells said finally. One that will follow you. The only mistake would be ignoring these symptoms. Sarah finished entering the order. I'd rather be wrong and thorough than right and negligent. Wells' face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a small sound from the patient. A weak groan that seemed to carry warning in its tone. CT will be ready in 10 minutes, a nurse announced from the doorway. Wells glared at Sarah. When this turns out to be nothing but a waste of resources, we'll discuss your tendency to overrule attending physicians. I look forward to that discussion, Sarah replied, checking the patient's pupils again. The difference in size had become more pronounced. As Wells stormed out, her heels clicking against the floor, Sarah turned to the nurse. Let's get him prepped for transport and draw blood for a complete coagulation panel. Yes, doctor. The nurse paused. For what it's worth, I think you're right about this one. Sarah nodded but kept her focus on the patient. She couldn't afford to think about anything else right now. Not Wells' threats, not the implications of her decision, not the weight of every eye in the department watching this drama unfold. The patient's hand twitched again. Sarah noticed a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool room temperature. Every instinct, every bit of training, every hour of study told her she was right. She had to be right. The alternative wasn't just professional suicide. It could be something far worse. Transport's on their way, another nurse announced. Sarah checked the time. 8 minutes until the CT scan would confirm her suspicions or destroy her credibility. 8 minutes that could change everything. For the patient, for her career, for every future resident who looked like her. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each second of those 8 minutes, as Sarah stood guard over her patient, waiting for either vindication or ruin. The CT scan room hummed with mechanical intensity as Sarah watched the images appear on the screen. Each cross-section of the patient's brain loaded with agonizing slowness, but she didn't need to see them all. The first few told her everything. There, she pointed to the monitor. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, just as suspected. The technician leaned closer. Good catch, Dr. Johnson. That could have been devastating if missed. Sarah was already reaching for her phone to call the neurology department when Dr. Wells burst through the door. Her face was flushed, her red blazer wrinkled from rapid movement. How dare you proceed without? Wells stopped mid-sentence, her eyes catching the CT images. For a moment, there was only the sound of the machine's hum. As you can see, Sarah said, keeping her voice professionally neutral, the patient requires immediate neurological intervention. I'm calling for a consult now. Wells stepped closer to the screen, her jaw tightening. I'll handle the neurology consult. I've already documented my initial findings, Sarah continued, and I'm ordering emergency. You've done quite enough, Dr. Johnson. Wells turned sharply. This is my patient now. You can return to the ER. The technician busied himself with the equipment, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Sarah stood her ground. With respect, Dr. Wells, I'd like to see this through. Would you? Wells' voice dripped with sarcasm. And I suppose you think one lucky guess makes you qualified to handle a critical neurological case? It wasn't a guess. Sarah pulled up the patient's initial symptoms on her tablet. It was a diagnosis based on clear clinical indicators that I documented, clinical indicators that you were not authorized to pursue. Wells stepped closer, lowering her voice. Let's be clear about something, Dr. Johnson. Your presence in this program. Let's just say the standards have become rather flexible in recent years. The technician dropped a clipboard, the clatter sharp in the tense room. Sarah felt her hands grow cold, but her voice remained steady. My presence in this program is based on merit, Dr. Wells. Just like this diagnosis was based on medical evidence. Merit? Wells laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. Is that what they're calling it now? Tell me, how many others had to be passed over to make room for your merit? Sarah's phone buzzed, the neurology department responding. She held Wells' gaze as she answered. Dr. Carter? Yes, this is Dr. Johnson. We have a confirmed subarachnoid hemorrhage in CT2. Patient is stable, but requiring immediate intervention. Wells snatched the phone. Jim? Catherine Wells here. Yes, I'll take it from here. Send your team down. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of activity. The patient was prepped for emergency surgery while Wells took charge, issuing orders and making calls. She pointedly ignored Sarah's presence, speaking over her when she tried to provide patient history to the neurology team. BP's rising, a nurse called out. Sarah stepped forward. He needs, step back, Dr. Johnson, Wells snapped. You're not needed here. The neurology team worked efficiently, but Sarah noticed their glances, some sympathetic, others curious, a few deliberately avoiding eye contact. The hospital gossip mill would be working overtime today. Dr. Johnson, the charge nurse touched her arm. We've got a new admission in the ER requiring immediate attention. It was a clear attempt to give her a graceful exit. Sarah looked at the patient one last time, stable now, in capable hands despite Wells' attitude, and nodded. Page me if anything changes, she said, knowing the order would be ignored. As she walked toward the door, Wells' voice carried across the room. This is exactly why we need to maintain traditional standards in our admissions. Imagine if she'd been wrong about this performance. Sarah's steps didn't falter. She kept walking, her back straight, her face composed. The same way she'd walked through 4 years of medical school, through countless rotations, through every subtle and not-so-subtle suggestion that she didn't belong. In the elevator, alone for a moment, she let out a long breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she clasped them together. The diagnosis had been right. The patient would live. That had to be enough. The elevator doors opened to controlled chaos, the normal state of the ER. Sarah checked the new patient chart, pushing everything else aside. She had a job to do. Dr. Johnson, a young nurse approached, hesitant. That patient you diagnosed? I just wanted to say, we all saw what happened up there. It's fine, Sarah said automatically. No, it's not. The nurse glanced around and lowered her voice. Dr. Wells has done this before. To others. But no one ever stands up to her because she had power, because she had connections, because she represented an old guard that still controlled too many things. Thank you, Sarah said quietly. But right now, we have patients who need our attention. She moved through the ER with practiced efficiency, examining patients, ordering tests, making decisions. Each interaction was a tiny rebellion, proof that she belonged here, that her judgment was sound, that she had earned every step of her journey. Her phone buzzed again, a message from the neurology department. The surgery was successful. The patient would recover fully, thanks to early intervention, thanks to her diagnosis, thanks to her insistence, thanks to her refusal to back down. The message concluded with a note. Excellent catch, Dr. Johnson. We'll make sure this is noted in the surgical report. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Documentation mattered. Evidence mattered. Facts mattered. Dr. Johnson. Another nurse appeared. We need you in Bay 6. New patient, semi-conscious, showing unusual symptoms. Sarah straightened her white coat and headed toward Bay 6. Whatever came next, she would face it the same way she faced everything else, with competence, with dignity, and with the absolute certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. Behind her, the elevator dinged again. Dr. Wells' voice carried across the ER, sharp and commanding. Sarah didn't turn around. She had patients to treat, lives to save, and a point to prove, one diagnosis at a time. The test results couldn't come fast enough. Sarah stood at the nurse's station, refreshing the computer screen every few minutes while keeping one eye on Bay 6. Her new patient lay there, unusually still for someone who was supposedly only mildly sedated. Dr. Johnson. The sharp voice cut through the ER's ambient noise. Dr. Wells approached, a group of medical students trailing behind her. I think this is an excellent teaching opportunity. Sarah's spine stiffened. She knew this tone. It was the prelude to something worse. Gather round, everyone, Wells announced, gesturing to the medical students. Dr. Johnson here has provided us with a perfect example of how not to handle patient care. The students shuffled uncomfortably. A few nurses paused in their work, watching. You see, Wells continued, her voice carrying across the department. Some of our newer doctors feel the need to overcompensate. They order excessive tests, ignore standard protocols, and generally waste hospital resources to prove themselves. Sarah kept her eyes on the computer screen. The tests were medically necessary, Dr. Wells, were they? Wells turned to the students. Let's review the case. A simple syncope presentation. Standard protocol calls for observation and basic labs. Instead, Dr. Johnson here insisted on a full CT workup. And why? Because she thought she knew better than her attending physician. The patient had a subarachnoid hemorrhage, Sarah said quietly. The CT scan saved his life. A lucky guess is not good medicine. Wells' voice rose. This kind of reckless behavior, this constant need to prove oneself. It's exactly what happens when we lower our standards for admission. The words hung in the air. A nurse dropped a clipboard. One of the medical students, a young black woman, stared at her shoes. Sarah turned from the computer, facing Wells directly. Are you suggesting my medical decisions are somehow connected to my race, Dr. Wells? I'm suggesting that your presence in this program reflects certain modern priorities that may not align with traditional medical excellence. Dr. seemed to hold its breath. Sarah felt every eye on her, felt the weight of this moment pressing down like a physical force. My presence in this program, she said, her voice steady, is based on my academic record, my MCAT scores, and my clinical performance. Just like everyone else. Is it? Wells smiled, the expression cold. Tell me, how many other candidates were passed over to fulfill diversity quotas? From base 6, a monitor beeped, a subtle change in rhythm. Sarah glanced that way, her doctor's instincts pulling her attention even in this moment. Dr. Wells, she said, I'm happy to discuss your concerns about my performance with the chief resident. But right now, I have a patient who needs attention. Oh yes? Wells' laugh was sharp. Another patient who probably needs excessive testing? More resources wasted to prove your competence. The monitor in Bay 6 beeped again. Sarah started to move, but Wells stepped in front of her. Let's make this a teaching moment, Wells announced to the students. Dr. Johnson, please explain to the group why you feel qualified to repeatedly override standard protocols. Sarah tried to step around her. My patient. Your patient can wait? Wells raised her voice further. This is about accountability. This is about standards. This is about ensuring that every doctor in this hospital is here because of their medical excellence, not because of some misguided attempt at social engineering. The monitor's beeping became more insistent. Sarah saw her patient's hand move slightly. Dr. Wells, she said firmly, you can question my judgment, my credentials, and my presence in this program all you want. But right now, my patient needs immediate attention. Your patient? Wells' face flushed red. Let me remind you of something, Dr. Johnson. Every patient in this hospital is ultimately my responsibility. And I will not stand by while an affirmative action resident compromises patient care with her need to prove herself. The words exploded across the ER. Someone gasped. A crash cart rolled to a stop in the corridor. And from base 6 came a sound, a distinct male voice. I believe, the voice said clearly, that this discussion has gone far enough. Every head turned toward base 6. The patient, the supposedly sedated patient, was sitting up, his expression alert and coldly furious. Sarah recognized him first, her breath catching in her throat. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the new hospital board director, swung his legs over the side of the bed. His gaze fixed on Dr. Wells, whose face had gone from red to ash white. Dr. Thompson, she stammered. We didn't realize I was conscious? He stood carefully, adjusting his hospital gown. Clearly not. Otherwise, you might have been more careful about expressing your professional opinions. The test results finally appeared on the computer screen behind them. Sarah glanced at them, then back at Dr. Thompson. "Sir," she said, maintaining her professional demeanor, "your blood work shows elevated levels that concern me. With your permission, I'd like to run additional tests." Thompson nodded. "Of course, Dr. Johnson. I trust your judgment completely." His eyes never left Dr. Wells. "Unlike some, I believe in evaluating doctors based on their actual medical expertise." Wells took a step backward. "Sir, I can explain." "Oh, I very much look forward to that explanation," Thompson said. "In fact, I believe we'll need a full administrative review of your teaching methods and patient care protocols." He turned to Sarah. "Dr. Johnson, please proceed with whatever tests you deem necessary. And afterward, I'd appreciate your attendance at a meeting with hospital administration." Sarah nodded, already moving to check his vitals. Around them, the ER burst into subtle motion. Nurses hurrying to their tasks, medical students dispersing, Dr. Wells standing frozen like a statue in a red blazer. And Dr. Wells. Thompson's voice carried authority despite his hospital gown. "I suggest you take the rest of the day to prepare your report. I expect a full accounting of every interaction you've had with Dr. Johnson, and indeed with all minority residents under your supervision." Wells turned and walked away, her heels no longer clicking with confidence against the floor. The ER gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but something had fundamentally changed. Sarah could feel it in the air, in the way people looked at her, in the subtle nods of respect from passing staff. She focused on her patient, checking his pupils, noting his vital signs. The work was what mattered. The medicine was what had always mattered. "Dr. Johnson," Thompson said quietly as she worked, "I want you to know that your handling of both medical situations today has been exemplary." "Thank you, sir," she replied, adjusting his fore. "But right now, I'm more concerned about your test results." He smiled slightly. "Proving my point exactly. Then, more seriously, we'll deal with everything else later. Right now, I'm just your patient." Sarah nodded and continued her examination. The test would show what they showed. The truth would come out, as it always did. And for once, someone had been awake to see it all. The ER buzzed with the electric energy of suppressed gossip. Dr. Thompson sat upright in his bed, monitoring leads still attached to his chest, while Sarah reviewed his latest test results on a tablet. "Your electrolyte levels are stabilizing," she reported, swiping through the data. "But I'm still concerned about Dr. Johnson," Thompson interrupted gently. "While I appreciate your dedication to my health, I believe we have some other matters to discuss." Sarah lowered the tablet. Around them, nurses and orderlies found sudden reasons to pass by base 6, their casual glances anything but casual. "Sir, your medical care should be our primary concern right now." Thompson's laugh was warm but tired. "You know that response right there? That's exactly why you belong here." He adjusted his position, wincing slightly. "But as your patient, I assure you I'm stable enough for a conversation." A commotion near the ER entrance drew their attention. Hospital administrators in suits rushed in, their faces a mix of concern and barely concealed panic. Leading them was Janet Chun, the chief of medicine. "Marcus, Dr. Chun called out, hurrying to base 6. "We just heard. Are you?" "I'm fine, Janet," Thompson replied, waving off her concern. Thanks to Dr. Johnson's excellent care, the administrators clustered around his bed, throwing uncertain glances at Sarah. She took a step back, ready to give them privacy. "Stay, Dr. Johnson," Thompson ordered. Then, to the administrators, "In fact, I'm glad you're all here. We need to discuss what happened today. Perhaps we should move this to a more private setting," one administrator suggested, eyeing the growing audience of hospital staff. "No," Thompson's voice was firm. "This happened in public. We'll address it in public." He turned to Sarah. "Dr. Johnson, would you please explain to my colleagues your initial diagnosis and the resistance you faced?" Sarah straightened her white coat, feeling the weight of every eye in the ER. The patient, Dr. Thompson, presented with symptoms suggesting a possible neurological event. When I recommended additional testing, Dr. Wells was openly racist, Thompson finished. Let's not dance around it. The administrators shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Chin's face darkened. Marcus, she said quietly, if Dr. Wells behaved inappropriately. Inappropriately? Thompson barked a laugh that turned into a slight cough. Sarah automatically checked his oxygen levels. Janet, she stood in this ER and suggested that Dr. Johnson was only here because of diversity quotas. She did this in front of medical students, staff, and what she thought was an unconscious patient. The silence that followed was deafening. A nurse dropped a supply box, the clatter making everyone jump. Dr. Johnson. Chin turned to her. Is this true? I have my duties to attend to, Sarah replied diplomatically, checking Thompson's for a line. No, Thompson interjected. No more deflection. No more pretending this isn't happening. Do you know what I saw today? I saw an excellent physician diagnose a potentially fatal condition, face outright discrimination for it, and still maintain absolute professionalism. He struggled to sit up straighter. Sarah moved to assist him, but he waved her off. I've been studying this hospital's diversity statistics for months, he continued. Do you know what I found? Pattern after pattern of qualified minority residents being passed over for advanced training, receiving lower performance evaluations despite better patient outcomes, being subjected to extra scrutiny for their medical decisions. The administrators looked like they wanted to sink into the floor. Dr. Chin's face had gone from dark to thunderous. We have protocols for reporting discrimination, she began. Protocols that require residents to risk their careers by filing formal complaints against their supervisors? Thompson shook his head. The system is designed to protect people like Dr. Wells, not Dr. Johnson. A young nurse stepped forward suddenly. It's true. We see it all the time. The way certain doctors treat minority residents, but nobody says anything because... She trailed off, but her courage sparked something. Other staff members began nodding, some stepping closer to Sarah's side. Dr. Wells has done this before, another nurse added. Everyone knows it, but she's protected, Thompson finished. Well, not anymore. He turned to the administrators. I want a full review of every complaint, formal or informal, against Dr. Wells. I want patient outcome data compared between minority residents and their peers. And I want it all on my desk tomorrow. Marcus, Chin said carefully, you're still a patient. Perhaps we should wait. I'm a patient who just witnessed blatant discrimination in your ER. Thompson's voice carried across the department. And Dr. Johnson? Instead of defending herself, she focused on patient care. She's still focusing on patient care. He nodded towards Sarah, who was checking his heart monitor. That's the kind of doctor this hospital needs. Sarah felt a warmth in her chest, but kept her face professional. Sir, your blood pressure is elevated. You need to rest. Thompson smiled. See what I mean? Then, to the administrators, I want Dr. Wells suspended pending investigation. I want a task force established to review our residency program's treatment of minorities. And I want Dr. Johnson to lead it. The ER had gone completely silent. Even the usual beeping of machines seemed muted. Sir, Sarah said quietly, I appreciate your support, but my focus needs to be on my medical duties. And it will be, Thompson assured her. But you'll also help us fix this. Because if we don't, how many other brilliant doctors will we lose to this kind of discrimination? Dr. Chin stepped forward. I'll handle Dr. Wells' suspension personally. She turned to Sarah. Dr. Johnson, when you're finished with your shift, we'll need your statement. Sarah nodded, already reaching for her stethoscope. First, I need to complete Dr. Thompson's cardiac workup. His earlier symptoms concern me. Thompson laughed again. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly why she should be teaching the next generation of doctors. He settled back against his pillows. Now, Dr. Johnson, you were saying something about my electrolyte levels. The administrators gradually dispersed, their hushed conversations mixing with the renewed bustle of the ER. Dr. Chun lingered a moment longer. Dr. Johnson, she said softly, I owe you an apology. We all do. Sarah met her eyes briefly. Right now, Dr. Chin, I owe my patient a thorough examination. As she began her assessment, Sarah felt something shift in the air around her. The weight she'd carried for so long, the need to be perfect, to be unassailable, to be twice as good, hadn't lifted entirely. But for the first time, she wasn't carrying it alone. Blood pressure's still high, she murmured, making notes on her tablet. Can't imagine why, Thompson replied dryly. Then, more seriously, you know this isn't over, right? There will be resistance to change. Sarah adjusted his cardiac monitor leads. There always is, sir. But right now, I'm more concerned about these readings. Thompson smiled and let her work. Around them, the ER continued its eternal rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. In the corners of her vision, Sarah saw staff members standing a little straighter, minority residents walking with more confidence. Sometimes she realized the most important diagnoses had nothing to do with medicine at all. The treatment plan for Dr. Thompson required careful monitoring. Sarah stood at his bedside, adjusting medication dosages while the hospital around them erupted in carefully controlled chaos. Your cardiac enzymes are trending down, she reported, checking the latest results. But I'd like to keep you overnight for observation. Thompson nodded, watching as another group of administrators hurried past his room. You know they're all scrambling to cover themselves now. A nurse entered with fresh 4 bags, her movements efficient but her eyes darting between them. The news had spread through the hospital like a virus. Dr. Wells suspended, the board director himself a witness to discrimination, emergency meetings being called. Dr. Johnson, the nurse said, Dr. Chen asked about your availability for a statement. After my shift, Sarah replied, not looking up from her charts. Patient care comes first. Thompson chuckled, then winced slightly. Still by the book, even now. The nurse finished changing the 4 bags and hurried out, nearly colliding with Dr. Roberts from cardiology in the doorway. Dr. Thompson, Roberts said, slightly out of breath. I came as soon as I heard. I can take over from here. Dr. Johnson is handling my care, Thompson interrupted. Unless she requests a consult, I'm quite satisfied with her treatment plan. Roberts blinked, threw an uncertain glance at Sarah, then retreated. Through the glass walls of the room, they could see him join a cluster of other physicians, all speaking in low, urgent tones. You'll be facing some backlash, Thompson warned, watching the gathering doctors. Not everyone will appreciate having their comfortable system disrupted. Sarah checked his oxygen levels. With all due respect, sir, you should focus on your recovery, not hospital politics. This is my recovery. Thompson gestured to the busy hallway outside. Watching a qualified physician do her job without interference? That's the best medicine I could ask for. Down the corridor, raised voices caught their attention. Dr. Wells stood at the nurse's station, her red blazer now wrinkled, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous, her voice carried through the glass. I've served this hospital for 15 years. You can't just, Catherine. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the commotion. My office. Now. Wells spotted Sarah through the glass. For a moment, their eyes met. Wells' face contorted with a mixture of fury and fear before Chen led her away. Your blood pressure's rising again, Sarah noted, checking the monitors. Can't imagine why, Thompson replied dryly. Then more seriously, Dr. Johnson, what happened today? It's just the beginning. Change won't come easily. Sarah adjusted his medication drip. Sir, right now my only concern is stabilizing your condition. A young resident appeared in the doorway. Dr. Patel, another minority physician who'd faced similar struggles. Her eyes were bright with barely contained emotion. Dr. Johnson, she said softly. We heard what happened. All of us. We just wanted to say. Dr. Patel, Sarah interrupted gently. Would you mind checking on my patient in room 204? His potassium levels needed monitoring. Patel straightened, understanding the deflection. Of course, doctor. Right away. As she left, Thompson shook his head. You can't keep deflecting forever. You're going to have to face what this means. What you've started, what I've started, Sarah replied, making notes in his chart, is a treatment plan that requires careful attention. Your latest EKG shows, Dr. Johnson. Thompson's voice was firm. Look at me. She met his eyes reluctantly. I've spent my career fighting these battles, he said. I know what it costs. The energy it takes to stay professional, to never show anger, to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. But today you did something more important than maintaining appearances. You showed everyone that excellence doesn't have a color. Sarah's hands tightened on her tablet. Outside, the hospital continued its frantic dance of damage control. Through the glass, she could see minority staff members walking taller, speaking more confidently, claiming their space in a way they hadn't before. "Sir," she said finally, "your cardiac rhythm is still irregular. You need to understand what happens next." Thompson shifted in his bed. "The hospital board meets tomorrow. They'll want to minimize this, sweep it under the rug. A quiet suspension, some sensitivity training, maybe a strongly worded memo about inclusivity. That's not my concern right now. It should be." Thompson's monitor beeped as his heart rate increased. "Because right now, you have leverage. They're terrified of what I saw, what I heard. This is your moment to demand real change." Sarah moved to adjust his medication. "You need to stay calm, Dr. Thompson. Your recovery. My recovery includes making sure this hospital becomes what it should be." He caught her wrist gently. "Stop hiding behind your professionalism for a moment and tell me, what changes would you make? What would have made your residency different?" For a long moment, Sarah stood still. Through the glass walls, she could see everything she'd endured reflected in the faces of other minority staff members. The subtle dismissals, the extra scrutiny, the constant need to prove themselves. "Better mentorship," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Protected channels for reporting discrimination. Blind review of resident evaluations. Regular analysis of patient outcomes across all demographics of physicians." Thompson smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Dr. Wells was being escorted out by security, her red blazer a splash of angry color against their dark uniforms. Staff members pressed against the walls, watching in stunned silence. "Your heart rate's elevated again," Sarah noted, turning back to the monitors. "Let it be," Thompson said. "Sometimes a little elevation is needed for healing." Sarah adjusted his pillows, checked his 4 lines, verified his medication doses. All the small, professional tasks that had become her armor over the years. "Dr. Johnson," Thompson said softly, "you can't go back to just being invisible now. You understand that, right?" Outside, Dr. Chun was gathering department heads for an emergency meeting. Through the glass, Sarah could see the fear on some faces, the calculation on others, the dawning realization on a few. "My shift ends in an hour," she said finally. "After I ensure you're stable and check on my other patients, I'll give my statement to administration." Thompson nodded. "And after that?" Sarah met his eyes. "After that, I'll do what I've always done, practice medicine to the best of my ability. But maybe now others won't have to work quite so hard to prove they belong here." "Good answer," Thompson said, settling back against his pillows. "Now, tell me more about those cardiac enzymes you're worried about." Sarah returned to her charts, to her monitors, to the medicine that had always been her refuge. But something had changed, not just in the hospital's atmosphere, but in herself. For the first time, excellence alone wasn't enough. It was time for excellence to have a voice. The hospital boardroom felt colder than the ER. Sarah sat straight-backed in an uncomfortable chair, facing a semicircle of administrators. Her white coat felt like armor. "Dr. Johnson," Dr. Chun began, shuffling papers at the head of the table. "Please describe the events leading to Dr. Wells' suspension." The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished wood. Dr. Thompson sat to Sarah's right, now in a suit despite her protest that he should still be resting. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Sarah began, her voice steady. "I received a patient presenting with symptoms suggesting neurological involvement." "Skip to the incident itself," one board member interrupted. "Harrison, according to his nameplate. We're more concerned about the interaction." Sarah met his eyes. "The incident occurred because I insisted on proper medical testing, which saved the patient's life. The medical details are relevant." Thompson smiled slightly. Several board members shifted in their seats. "Continue, Dr. Johnson," Chin directed, shooting Harrison a warning look. Sarah walked them through every detail. The initial examination, Wells' dismissal of her concerns, the escalating confrontation. She kept her voice clinical, as if presenting a case study. And then Dr. Wells suggested my presence in the program was due to alternative admission standards. She finished. She called it affirmative action. Thompson corrected sharply. Let's not sanitize racism. The boardroom temperature seemed to drop another degree. Harrison cleared his throat. While Dr. Wells' comments were clearly inappropriate. Illegal, Thompson interrupted. The word you're looking for is illegal. We need to consider her years of service, Harrison continued. Her record of excellence. Excellence? A new voice cut through the tension. Dr. Patel stood in the doorway, a stack of papers in her hands. Behind her, a group of minority residents and staff members lined the hallway. Dr. Patel, Chin began, this is a closed meeting. I have documentation. Patel stepped forward, dropping the papers on the table. 3 years of systematically lower evaluations for minority residents under Dr. Wells. Patient outcome data, showing we consistently matched or exceeded our peers despite these evaluations. Witness statements from nurses and staff about her pattern of discrimination. The board members stared at the growing pile of evidence. Sarah recognized the work of many hands in those papers. Hours of quiet documentation, of bearing witness, of waiting for this moment. This is irregular, Harrison protested. We have protocols. Your protocols protected her, Thompson said quietly. Never them. He nodded toward Sarah. Tell them what happened after the initial incident, Dr. Johnson. Sarah straightened in her chair. Dr. Wells attempted to turn it into a teaching moment. She gathered medical students to demonstrate why minority residents shouldn't be trusted with critical decisions. And yet your decisions saved my life, Thompson added. Chin picked up one of Patel's reports, her face darkening as she read. These evaluation discrepancies, they're statistically impossible without bias. We've been keeping records, Patel said. More staff members had filtered into the room, standing silently along the walls. Every comment, every unfair evaluation, every case where we were right but got criticized anyway. We just never had anyone willing to listen before. Harrison wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Even if there were issues with Dr. Wells' teaching methods, we need to handle this discreetly. The hospital's reputation will be destroyed if this goes public, Thompson finished. Which it will if you try to sweep it under the rug. I witnessed everything. I'm a rather credible witness, don't you think? The threat hung in the air. Board members exchanged nervous glances. What do you want? Chin asked, looking at Sarah. For the first time since entering the room, Sarah felt her professional mask slip slightly. She looked at the faces around her, the worried administrators, the hopeful staff members, the young residents seeing perhaps their first chance at real change. I want what I've always wanted, she said. I want to practice medicine. I want to be judged by my work, not my race. I want system-wide changes, Thompson supplied. He pulled out a document. I took the liberty of drafting some proposals. Blind review of resident evaluations. Regular audits of patient outcomes across demographic groups. A mentorship program for minority medical students. And a complete overhaul of how we handle discrimination complaints. That's extensive, Harrison stammered. It's necessary, Patel countered. More voices of agreement came from the crowd at the door. Chin studied the proposal, her expression unreadable. This will take time. Resources. Less time and resources than a discrimination lawsuit, Thompson pointed out. Less than the cost of losing talented physicians because we failed to protect them. Sarah watched the calculations play across the board members' faces. Fear of publicity warring with institutional inertia. Cost analysis battling with moral imperative. Dr. Johnson, Chin said finally. You've been remarkably quiet about what you want personally from this situation. Sarah stood, her white coat catching the morning light. What I want is to get back to my patients. But I want to do it in a hospital where every doctor can focus on medicine instead of proving they belong here. Where excellence is recognized regardless of what the excellent doctor looks like. She gestured to the crowd at the door. We're not asking for advantages. We're asking for the barriers to be removed, for the playing field to be level, for the chance to be doctors without also having to be symbols or survivors or examples. Well said, Thompson murmured. Chen looked around the room, at the faces of change demanding to be seen. She picked up Thompson's proposal. We'll need to draft implementation plans, she said. Set up committees. No more committees, Thompson interrupted. No more studies or reviews or discussions. Changes start today. Today, Sarah repeated firmly. Harrison started to protest, but Chun held up her hand. Today, she agreed. Dr. Johnson, would you be willing to help oversee these changes? In addition to your regular duties, of course. Sarah thought of her packed schedule, her patient load, the countless demands already on her time. Then she thought of Dr. Patel and all the others watching, waiting, hoping. Yes, she said, but my patients come first. They always have, Thompson observed. That's rather the point, isn't it? The morning light had shifted, eliminating the shadows in the boardroom. Outside, the hospital continued its eternal rhythm of saving lives, healing wounds, making whole what was broken. If there's nothing else, Sarah said, checking her watch, I have patients waiting. She turned to leave, her white coat sweeping behind her like a banner. The crowd at the door parted, some reaching out to touch her sleeve, others simply nodding in silent thanks. Dr. Johnson, Chen called after her. This won't be easy. Change never is. Sarah paused in the doorway. Neither is medicine. We do it anyway. She stepped into the hallway, already mentally reviewing her patient list for the day. Behind her, she could hear the boardroom erupting into discussion, planning, argument. But ahead of her lay what mattered most. The work itself, the practice of medicine, the chance to save lives without the weight of prejudice dragging at her coat. For the first time in her career, that weight felt just a little lighter. The hospital corridors looked different a month later. Sarah noticed it in small ways. Minority residents walking with their heads higher, senior staff making eye contact instead of looking past them, a new energy in the morning rounds. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Patel jogged to catch up with her near the ER entrance. The new evaluation system you implemented? It's already showing results. Sarah reviewed the tablet Patel handed her. The numbers told a clear story. With blind review in place, minority residents' scores had risen significantly, now matching their documented patient outcomes. Good, Sarah said, returning the tablet. But remember, patient care comes first, Patel finished with a smile. We know. You remind us every day. The ER doors slid open, bringing in a rush of cold morning air and a new group of medical students. Sarah noticed their diversity immediately, faces that might have been rare in these halls just weeks ago. Dr. Johnson, a young black student, stepped forward. I'm Maya Williams. We were told you'd be leading orientation today. Sarah checked her watch. Between her regular duties, the new mentorship program, and the ongoing system changes, her schedule was packed tighter than ever. Follow me, she said, leading the group through the ER. First thing you need to know, medicine doesn't care what you look like. It only cares if you get it right. The students trailed behind her as she checked on patients, their notebooks out, eyes wide. Sarah stopped at each bed, explaining procedures, asking questions, demonstrating the blend of knowledge and instinct that made good medicine. Dr. Johnson, a familiar voice made her turn. Dr. Chen stood in the doorway of Bay 4, where their first crisis had begun. Do you have a moment? Sarah turned to the students. Review the cases we just saw. I'll be right back. Chen's office was different too. The walls now covered with data charts tracking the hospital's transformation. Sarah sat in what had become her usual chair. The board is impressed, Chen began, shuffling through reports. Patient satisfaction up 12%. Resident retention improved. Even our recruitment numbers are better. Medicine improves when we let doctors focus on being doctors, Sarah replied. True. Chen set down the papers. Which is why we want to make your position permanent. Director of Diversity and Medical Excellence. Sarah raised an eyebrow. I already have a job. Taking care of patients. You can do both. Chun leaned forward. You already are doing both. This just makes it official. Gives you real authority to continue the changes you've started. Through the office window, Sarah could see her group of students still discussing cases, their faces animated. Maya Williams was making a point, her hands moving confidently as she explained something to her peers. The mentorship program is working, Chen added, following her gaze. Those students? They're here because they heard about what happened, about how this hospital is changing. Sarah thought about her packed schedule, the constant balancing act between patient care and institutional reform. I won't give up my clinical duties. We wouldn't want you to. Chun smiled. Your medical excellence is the whole point. You're proving every day that diversity and quality aren't opposing forces. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Thompson entered, moving more smoothly now after his recovery. Ah, good, he said, seeing Sarah. I hope to catch you both. The new complaint system caught its first case. Sarah straightened. They designed the system carefully. Anonymous reporting, protected channels, independent review board. How bad? Another DR. Wells in the making, Thompson said grimly. Cardiology department. Same pattern. Subtle discrimination, biased evaluations, professional retaliation. Was Chin corrected? They're being suspended pending review. No more years of quiet discrimination while evidence builds. Sarah stood, checking the time. My students are waiting. Your students? Thompson smiled. See how naturally that comes now? Outside Chin's office, the hospital hummed with activity. Sarah watched Maya Williams handle a patient interview, her technique already showing promise. Dr. Johnson, Maya called out. I think I noticed something in the patient's symptoms. Sarah moved to check, the familiar rhythm of teaching and healing falling into place. Around them, the hospital continued its transformation, slow in some places, faster in others, but steady as a heartbeat. A group of minority residents passed by, their white coats crisp, their steps confident. They nodded to Sarah, no longer with desperate gratitude, but with professional respect. What did you notice? Sarah asked Maya, turning her attention to the patient. The pulse is irregular, but not in the usual way. I think. Don't think. No. Sarah handed her the stethoscope. Medicine isn't about thinking you're right. It's about being right. Maya listened carefully, her face concentrated. There's a murmur, third heart sound, but with an extra. Good. Sarah watched the young doctor in training, seeing shadows of her own journey. Now, what does that tell us? The day flowed around them, patients, procedures, teaching moments. Sarah moved through it all with the same focused energy she'd always had, but something was different. The weight of being the only one, of having to be perfect, had lifted. Near the end of her shift, she passed the wall of department heads' photos. A space was being cleared for a new addition, Director of Diversity and Medical Excellence. Dr. Johnson, another resident, rushed up. We have a complex case in Bay 3. Would you mind taking a look? Sarah followed, her white coat swishing behind her. In the patient's room, a team of doctors had gathered, diverse faces, unified purpose, focused entirely on medicine. Walk me through it, she said, and the medicine took over, as it always had, as it always should. Later, reviewing charts at the nurse's station, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a darkened window. The same doctor she'd always been, but now with something more, not just permission to excel, but the power to ensure others could too. Dr. Johnson, Maya appeared at her elbow. Thank you for everything you've done here, for making it possible for us to be doctors, Sarah finished. Now prove you deserve to be here. Not to me, not to them, to your patients. Maya nodded and hurried off. Sarah returned to her charts, to her patients, to the practice of medicine that had always been her true north. The hospital lights hummed overhead, the same as they had that first morning when everything changed. But now they illuminated a different kind of healing, not just of bodies, but of a system that had been sick for far too long. A new case came in. Sarah stood, adjusted her white coat, and moved forward. There was always more work to do, more lives to save, more changes to make. But now, finally, she could focus on the medicine. And that had been the point all along. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same ER where everything had changed, watching a new class of residents begin their first day. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching on white coats that represented every shade of humanity. Remember, she addressed the group, her voice carrying the authority she'd earned twice over. Medicine doesn't care about your background. It cares about your knowledge, your dedication, and your ability to put patients first. Maya Williams, now halfway through her residency, stood among the experienced residents. Her confidence had grown, matching her competence. Dr. Johnson, a new voice called from the entrance. A young black resident, fresh-faced and nervous, stepped forward. I'm Dr. Marcus Thompson, Jr. My father suggested I do my residency here. Sarah smiled slightly. Your father's name might have opened the door, but your work will determine if you stay. Yes, ma'am. He straightened his white coat. He told me what happened here. What you did. What we all did, Sarah corrected, gesturing to the diverse staff around them. Now, ready for your first case? The ER door slid open, bringing in the controlled chaos that was their daily routine. Sarah led the new residents through their first morning rounds, watching them navigate the complex dance of emergency medicine. Incoming trauma, a nurse called out. Multiple victims, car accident. Sarah watched her team snap into action. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just pure medical focus. Maya took charge of one patient, her movements confident and precise. Thompson, Jr. jumped in to assist, his nervousness replaced by professional concentration. Good catch, Sarah noted as Maya identified a subtle symptom. What's your treatment plan? Maya laid out her approach, clear and methodical. Around them, other residents worked with similar focus, their differences forgotten in the shared purpose of saving lives. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with satisfaction. Quite a change from 6 months ago. The medicine hasn't changed, Sarah replied, checking a patient's vitals. Just who's allowed to practice it properly. The morning unfolded with a rhythm unique to emergency medicine. Sarah moved from case to case, teaching, guiding, but increasingly stepping back to let her residents take the lead. Dr. Johnson, Thompson, Jr. called out, I think I'm seeing something unusual in these test results. Sarah reviewed his findings, remembering another day when she'd spotted something others had missed. What's your recommendation? He hesitated for a moment, then straightened. Additional testing, even if it seems excessive. Better to be thorough than sorry. Correct. Sarah nodded. Order the tests. No one questioned the order. No one suggested quotas or special treatment. The medicine spoke for itself, as it always should have. Near the end of the morning shift, Sarah gathered her team for case reviews. The conference room, once a place of subtle exclusion, now held a rainbow of faces united by white coats and shared purpose. Last case, she announced. Unexpected cardiac presentation in Bay 4. Dr. Williams, walk us through it. Maya stood, presenting the case with quiet confidence. Other residents added observations, suggested alternatives, engaged in the kind of open medical discussion that good medicine required. Questions? Sarah asked when Maya finished. Thompson, Jr. raised his hand. How did you know to check for that obscure enzyme marker? Because I didn't let anyone tell me not to, Maya replied, glancing at Sarah. I followed the medicine where it led. After the meeting, Sarah walked through the ER, observing her transformed department. The old hierarchy of privilege and prejudice had been replaced by a pure meritocracy of medical excellence. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Thompson Sr., appeared beside her, looking fully recovered from his own medical crisis. Checking on my son? Checking on all of them, she corrected. But he's doing well. He has good instincts, like someone else I know. Thompson watched the busy ER. You've built something remarkable here. We built it, Sarah said. All of us who refuse to be less than what we are. A trauma alert sounded. Sarah watched her team mobilize, every color, every background, moving as one medical unit. Still doing double duty? Thompson asked. Clinical work and administration? The administration supports the medicine, Sarah replied. The medicine proves why the changes matter. She moved to assist with the trauma case, but her residents had it well in hand. Maya directed treatment with calm authority. Thompson, Jr. anticipated needs before they arose. Others contributed seamlessly, their differences irrelevant in the face of medical necessity. Dr. Johnson, a nurse called from Base 6, Remember that patient from 6 months ago? The one with the unusual symptoms everyone missed? Sarah walked to Bay 6, the same bay where Dr. Wells had made her last stand against progress. Now it held a young patient being treated by a diverse team of residents. "What do you see?" she asked them. They reported their observations, each building on the others. No one held back for fear of overstepping. No one doubted their right to speak. "Good," Sarah said. "Now prove it with medicine." The day continued, each case a testimony to what was possible when barriers fell and excellence was all that mattered. Sarah moved through her dual roles, physician and changemaker, with the same dedication she'd always had. As her shift ended, she stood at the nurse's station where it had all begun. The ER hummed with professional energy, every white coat representing a victory over prejudice. Every saved life, proving why diversity made medicine stronger. Dr. Johnson, Maya approached. "That moment 6 months ago, when you stood up to Dr. Wells, did you know what would happen?" Sarah thought about that morning. The fear, the anger, the determination to be right that had overcome her fear of speaking up. "I knew I had to follow the medicine," she said simply. Everything else followed from that. Maya nodded and returned to her patients. Sarah watched her go, seeing in her confident stride the future of medicine. A future where excellence knew no color, where healing had no bias, where white coats were just white coats. Her pager beeped. Another case, another chance to prove what she'd always known, that good medicine transcended everything else. Sarah straightened her coat and headed toward her next patient. The morning light caught her badge, now reading Dr. Sarah Johnson, Director of Diversity and Medical Excellence. But more importantly, it caught her stethoscope, the true symbol of what she'd fought for, what they'd all fought for. The right to be doctors. Nothing more, nothing less. Just doctors, saving lives one patient at a time.